GI physiology, stimulation of acid secretion. All right, so this video we're just going to discuss what happens and how the acid is secreted originally in the stomach. So there's three separate ways. This is how I break it down in my head. There's three separate ways in which we could stimulate acid, gastric acid production. Okay, the first one is by direct gastrin. Right, so we already discussed gastrin is going to bind CCKB receptors, not too high yield, but directly to the parietal cells. So gastrin binds directly to parietal cells to stimulate gastric acid production. Okay, so that's the first way, and I call it direct gastrin. All right, so that's the first mechanism overall, is the direct gastrin mechanism. Number two is known as the indirect gastrin mechanism in my mind. So gastrin also can bind ECL cells, which release histamine. And then histamine is going to bind parietal cells at H2 receptors to produce gastric acid. Okay, so that's the second mechanism. All right, so the first mechanism, gastrin binds directly to parietal cells. The second mechanism, gastrin binds to a different cell type that produces histamine, and then histamine goes and binds parietal cells to produce gastric acid. And then the last mechanism, three, the vagus nerve mechanism, is that the vagus nerve is going to release acetylcholine, which binds muscarinic or M3 receptors on parietal cells, which produce gastric acid. Okay? Vagus nerve is also going to activate G cells to secrete gastrin. Okay? But it uses GRP, not acetylcholine, in that factor. Okay? So just to kind of get that last one, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is going to do two things. It's going to release acetylcholine to bind M3 receptors on parietal cells in order to secrete acid. But it also is going to secrete GRP, not acetylcholine. It's going to secrete GRP to bind G cells in order to secrete gastrin. All right? So those three mechanisms are very important for you to understanding the stimulation of acid secretion. Okay? It's very straightforward. I hope that kind of outlines it in a very simple way for you. Now, the primary way that gastric acid is secreted is through its gastrin's effect on ECL cells. So the indirect gastrin effect, that mechanism, is the primary way that you're going to have gastric acid production. Okay, so the indirect gastrin, so gastrin is going to bind the ECL cells, which release histamine, and then histamine is going to bind the parietal cells. Okay, so that's kind of the primary way. Now, something that they want you to know is that, well, let's say we give a patient atropine. So we give a patient atropine in order to block the vagus nerve's effect or acetylcholine's effect from the vagus nerve on the parietal cells. Well, guess what? The vagus nerve releases GRP also, not only acetylcholine. It releases GRP also that binds to G cells to produce gastrin. So atropine will not help patients that have increased levels of gastric acid. All right, it's not going to be a useful thing to decrease the amount of acid production or secretion because the vagus nerve does two things. It produces acetylcholine and it produces GRP in order to produce gastric acid. All right. Now, a couple other things that you should take into account for gastric acid secretion. Gastric acid secretion is going to increase when you are in the cephalic and gastric phases of eating. Okay, so there's the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal. Okay, the cephalic and gastric phases obviously are when the food's in your mouth, the cephalic, or in your head, right? It's in the cephalic portion. Cephalic means head. Or when it's in the gastric portion, the food's in your stomach. Okay. That makes logical sense because the food is about to reach your stomach in the cephalic phase and it's going to be in your stomach in the gastric phase. So you want more gastric acid secretion there to break down the food that's coming or that's currently present. Now, when it's in, like when we have intestinal influences are going to decrease gastric acid secretion because that means the food's now already reached the intestines and we don't want more acid to be pouring into the duodenum. We need a protective mechanism. Okay, the food's already here. We don't want more acid. Got it? So that's where you're going to see a decrease in gastric acid secretion. Okay, last thing, kind of a callback to endocrine. I know you guys hate this. I hated it too, but it's just the cell signaling. So acetylcholine and gastrin function via the GQ cell signaling pathway. Histamine is going to function via the GS signaling pathway. And somatostatin and prostaglandins are going to function via the GI pathway. All right? So that's overall what you need to take away. Remember the three key points: direct gastrin mechanism, the indirect gastrin mechanism, and then the vagus nerve mechanism, okay, and how that produces acid. That's all for gastric acid production.